Our first speaker, guest speaker, is actually from the, excuse me, the Michigan State University, and someone said you couldn't find anybody in Kansas to speak, and I said, well, both of our next speakers used to teach in Kansas, and it was actually some of their students that recommended them. So they have connections to Kansas, and they've got some students that are still operating in the agricultural business in Kansas that recommended Janice and Dan, our next two speakers. So introducing Janice Swanson is from Michigan State. Is she responsible stewardship? She's going to talk about responsible stewardship of farm animals and animal welfare. Dr. Swanson's outreach includes leadership and guidance in the development of science-based. Now, we've heard that a lot lately, science-based recommendations for continuous improvement in the well-being of farm animals. So I'd like you all to welcome our virtual presenter today, Dr. Janice Swanson.
Thank you. I'm really appreciate being here today, and really appreciate too that it was a former student that actually recommended me to come here. I spent 15 years on faculty at Kansas. It was a wonderful experience, and my colleague Dan Thompson was there too. I was actually on the search committee, I guess, that hired him. So we have stayed in contact for quite some time. So I will go ahead and share my screen then, and hopefully that will go well. Well, first of all, I want to thank you all for inviting me to be with you today. And hopefully we're going to have a really good time talking a bit about good stewardship of animals. And I'm going to take more of a overview approach to this presentation and really take you through sort of a historical standpoint of looking at stewardship of animals, bringing you into the present, talking about some of the challenges that we're facing. And then my buddy Dan Thompson is probably going to do a much deeper dive into how things are happening with regard to the supply chain, the types of pressures that are coming on farmers and ranchers in this context. So I think hopefully we're going to do pretty well as a tag team on this today. So I will start with talking a little bit about the historical perspectives. Then we'll get into animal welfare in general, what it is, the working definition of animal welfare, what the public tends to be most concerned about, looking at how U.S. agriculture has actually responded to this new framework that we're in with regard to animal welfare, the challenges, and then come up with some concluding statements. So, you know, this idea and notion of stewardship has really been developing over a long period of time. And I think many of you recognize this as a cave painting that came out of the famous La Cope cave in France, depicting animals on the wall. And if you take a look at this, certainly it's bovine, all right? But we've been contemplating these issues about our place and relationship with animals and our obligations for a real long time. And it's reflected in the artwork we do. It's reflected in many of the great writings that have been written over time. And it's also reflected in how the biological world has developed over time, starting with looking at the domestication of animals. In this depiction, going from the first cave painting into this cave painting, you can see, you know, we have people, we have animals, we have definitely cattle, looking as if they're being tended to by people. Possibly this is a skin that's stretched out over here. But this is really the beginning of the dynamic between domesticating these animals that we now call our farm animals and really contemplating what the human interaction with these animals ought to be. If you didn't know, there's really quite an archaeological record with regard to the domestication of animals. And people have been studying this for quite some time. You know, it's a real fascination of how wild type animals were actually able to be domesticated. And what was it? What type of selection pressure was there not only in the environment that they lived in, but by human beings that actually drove a certain set of animals to be able to adapt and coexist with human beings. And if you take a look at this chart along this timeline, of course, we know the most about dogs. Dogs have been a fascination for a long time with regard to this. People are still arguing about the timeline of dogs. But if you look down this list, you have pigs, you have cows. Most of these animals here are all farmed. They're all farm animals with the exception of cats and dogs, although in some countries they do eat cats and dogs too. But these are the primarily the only animals that are really considered to be fully domestic type animals. And so it's with quite a fascination that we see that a lot of the animals that we have come into very close contact with managing and stewarding over a long period of time have actually served humanity in a very specific way. And I only put this up here for a minute because the question about how domestication started in this pressure between humans and animals is also a way of trying to study the genetics of domestication. These are just pictures from a very famous experiment called the Fox Farm experiment that happened back in the 1930s in Russia by a scientist by the name of Dmitry Belyaev. And what Belyaev did is ask the central question, what was it? What was the selection pressure that may have caused animals to be able to come into this coexistence with human beings? And remarkably, to the degree that they have. And he took wild type foxes that were being farmed at the time and only exerted the selection pressure of tameness on these animals. For generations, they would do a test, a human approach test, and so on, to see which foxes were willing to come into closer proximity. And over generations, they kept selecting for this. And what happened was quite remarkable. Is you had these fantastic changes in coat colors, you had changes in morphology, you had changes in behavior, changes in reproduction, and so on. And this was the expression of becoming domestic. And so only about 15 species over time have been fully domesticated. We know that there's changes in behavior, morphology. They're not all uniform across all types of animals. But there are some characteristics that we share in common with these animals is that they're social animals. They live in groups. They're amenable to coexisting with humans. And most of all, they reproduce under captive conditions. And the chart on the side here is really just a list of the types of changes in morphology that we've seen. Certainly cranial facial morphology has changed a lot. The eyes getting bigger, the head becoming broader, the nose becoming shorter. And one of the things we used to have a wildlife biologist in Kansas State who would come in with the skulls of pigs that had been at one time domestic pigs that were fertilized out on Fort Riley. And when he brought those skulls in to look at the changes, the dynamic changes that happened between those times, the time that those pigs, and let's say those that survived well enough to gradually breed and through generations, that what happens is their snout elongates, their hair coat comes back, it's thick and bristly, their eyes become smaller, and the morphological changes. So this is looking at becoming undomesticated and fertilized in the reverse. So it's a fascinating dynamic to watch. But domestication had a profound effect on explaining what our relationships and stewardship of animals should be. And of course, we see this reflected over time in historic writings, the religious writings and leaders. Of course, many of you would recognize St. Francis of Assisi, who is the patron saint of animals. Philosophers also had great writings on this. And of course, you had the cultures of indigenous peoples who had, in many respects, a more integrative view of animals. In most of our westernized culture, it was typically organized with humans, everything else, and then what the human obligations were to everything else. And so for a long, long time, that was sort of the idea, and looking at this depiction here of how human beings sort of had dominion over animals, right? We had this hierarchy. And even in the natural way of thinking of things, you quite often saw this in the scientific writings and biological writings over time. However, that started to change. And I bring this up because it's often a quite an interesting study, and when we actually at some point, at least in this country, although we were still a colony of England at that time, some of the first laws here that started to give us some bracketing around what was meant by stewardship. So these are some of the early examples of what it looked like to have anti-cruelty laws and some notion of what animal welfare is. And you can see this in the writings here, the laws that were put in for the Massachusetts Bay Colony of not exercising any type of tyranny or cruelty towards animals. And then also in item 93 here, you can also see that they were also obligated to rest them if they were hungry or they fell sick or they became lame, and that they were given permission to be able to drive these animals into an open area, regardless of who owned it, just as long as it wasn't corn or a meadow or something that was designated for a particular use. But this is probably the earliest notion that we had of how we were going to view our relationship and stewardship of animals, particularly farm animals. And if you think about it, back at that time, these animals were absolutely critical to the survival of the colony. They provided transportation, they provided meat, they provided milk. To lose an animal like that meant it could mean the survivability of the entire colony. So they had strict ideas about how you were to treat animals back then. But of course, we know these views are ever changing. And most of us, and I know that based on the information I have, a lot of you, some of you are farmers and ranchers, many of you are working in ag like I am. And we know that through the scientific work that we've done, through the animal sciences and the biological science, we've come upon information that bring us new obligation to these animals. If you look at any of the sciences that we have with regard to farming and ranching of animals, things like animal nutrition and so on, when we discovered that there were certain nutrients that these animals had, we had an obligation to begin to supply them to them. It is also, these scientific revelations have also informed our discussions about where animals are and what their places are among us. And what has really kind of happened over time, and I'd say especially in the last 50 years, we've gone from this notion of, having this triangular pattern with humans at the apex to now that's morphing more to a pattern of looking like how humans actually integrate with nature. And it drives a lot of the discussions with regard to sustainability, the natural environment, and also, where are we in this complex and where are these animals in this complex and how do we treat them and manage them under the types of conditions that we're becoming more and more obligated to over time. So you'll see the language of stewardship that's used in a lot of different ways. If you were working with a foundation, for example, stewardship of funds, any industry or anybody who is charged with overseeing something is overseeing responsible management and is entrusted with the care of the individual or whatever it is that they're overseeing. Aldo Leopold actually championed the use of the term of environmental stewardship based on his land ethic, in which he was taking a more holistic approach to man's relationship to land and animals and the plants that grow in it. And also, again, we do have indigenous cultures and people that strive to be respectful of their environments and honor the lives of animals by only taking what they need. And we find that these differences in ideas about our responsibilities to animals are do and sometimes will clash with regard to our thoughts of what we can do and what we can't do. So in animal agriculture, I would say, based on writings and the things that I've seen historically, that really stewardship is the farmer's oath. And I think if you were to suggest otherwise, most farmers and ranchers will look at you and say, are you kidding? This is something that's been an expectation of us for a very, very long time. And whether they grew into that expectation through religion or through the writings of others, but it's deeply ingrained that they're expected to be good stewards of land and animals. And if you go back and take a look at the writings of Thomas Jefferson, for example, he holds farmers up as being the citizen prototype that people should strive to be. And a lot of that had to do with their dedication to doing things for others. And in that primary sense, it had to do with food production and also the sense of community. What we're being challenged with in animal agriculture is this evolving landscape of what good stewardship means, and from a diverse societal perspective. And that is not something that is easy to contend with by any means. So some of the things that we have learned, and especially I've learned over the last 20 to 30 years of working in this area of animal welfare, is that sometimes the terms that we use in animal agriculture can and do sometimes confuse people. But we also know that in a lot of some of the writings that I see that challenge us, a lot of them go back to the notion of animal husbandry. And when we flipped from the language of animal husbandry, and face it, Kansas State used to be a Department of Animal Husbandry many, many years ago, same with Michigan State. A lot of the universities had that name. And that term always carried this idea of an ethic of care and the different types of techniques and management and production practices that we had to accomplish that care. It was a very historic term that was used for many, many years. Around the 50s or so, animal science departments, and mostly post-World War II, they took on the term of animal science. And that kind of stripped it of this notion of care that was really attached to the term husbandry. Now, I'm not saying we forgot about that, but it does imply to some people, and if you look at some of the writings of modern philosophers on this, they contend that when we changed from animal husbandry, we actually changed the ethical approach to how we looked at the use of animals and the way we treated animals as well. And so we always have talked in the terms of animal production, in terms of focus on those different scientific elements of how best to breed, feed, raise, and manage animals efficiently for food. And there's some that propose that our focus on that was too much on that, and that we have pushed some of these animals to their biological limits. And we need to reconsider the type of care we've had. And so you've had a growth in the concern of animal welfare over the years. So that's where we'll segue into this idea of animal welfare. And I know many of you are familiar with it, whether you want to call it animal well-being or animal welfare. I think most people in common terms recognize this as being animal welfare. So working definition. I think some of you out there are certainly familiar with the OIE, or the World Organization for Animal Health. OIE is really the French acronym for this organization. They're very similar to the World Health Organization that focuses mostly on human disease and so on, but the World Organization of Animal Health focuses on primarily animals. And back in the early 2000s, the World Trade Organization asked the World Organization of Animal Health to take on the issue of animal welfare because they were bumping into trade issues with regard to certain countries who had imposed laws about the treatment of farm animals, not wanting to do trade, particularly with countries like ours who did not have structured laws around the care and treatment of farm animals, at least beyond that of the laws that we have on the books with regard to animal cruelty or humane slaughter. And so they had to strive to put together steering committees with representatives of all the member countries and be able to shepherd through guidelines that could have some global meaning of setting a baseline standard for animal care. And my buddy Dan Thompson was one of those representatives from the United States who sat and guided the development of those guidelines and standards for beef production. And so they came up, and this working definition has morphed over time, but it also gives you an idea that this is a global conversation that's going on, even not just with first world countries, it's also being developed through developing countries as well, because they want to do trade with the rest of the world. And so this working definition, I think, actually is much better than the original definition that they had started with back in 2002. And as you can see, it's got all the components here and actually undergirded by scientific evidence that they're in a good state of welfare if they're healthy, they're comfortable, they're well nourished, they're safe, they're able to express innate behavior, which always is a place where we garner a lot of discussion. And if it is not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress. And so in some ways, you get an idea here of what animal welfare actually is. Some of the other previous definitions were a bit more nebulous, and it allowed for a lot of machinations about, well, is it just about behavior? Is it just about, well, here it gives you an idea of the whole scope of what it means to have to care for an animal and for an animal to be in good welfare. Also along the way, scientists have developed a view of how we work with this concept in terms of tackling these issues of animal welfare. We've had to get the tools to be able to do biological and scientific investigations of many of the issues and the problems that are brought to bear with regard to how we house and we feed and we care for and we manage our animals. And so this 3 spheres of animal welfare, it's been around for a while and people are still working with it. But if you're going to look at an animal, you're going to look at it from a holistic standpoint. You need to understand the physiological and physical status of the animal, the health, the disease status, are they pain free, immune status, and so on. You need to know the mental status, and that's probably the easiest way to put this. We talk about it in terms of negative and positive afferent states. But this is a better way to really express it in many respects. Is the animal content? Is it distressed? How does it feel with regard to the environment, the surroundings, and the interactions that they're having with humans? And then the naturalness of the environment is the other thing. And this is where a lot of the public has landed over the last few years. Yes, they'll pick on those things that when it comes to their attention with regard to animal pain or disease events or something. But the type of environment that we keep animals in has been an ongoing conversation for over 20 years. Since we went into higher density confinement types of systems for some of these animals, there has been a raging conversation in this particular area. So the public tends to be more ensconced in this particular area. It's not that they're not concerned of the others, but their idea of animal welfare in some respects is centered around this housing system, which has also been propagated through a lot of the campaigns by many of the animal protection groups as well. But when we look at it as scientists, we're looking at the nexus of all this and the integration of these circles to be able to look at how we can develop an environment in which we know we have healthy, productive animals. They can still produce efficiently, but their welfare is in a reasonably good state. When we study these things, it usually takes a multidisciplinary approach. We have a lot of scientists that are engaged in a lot of different ways. It really depends on the questions asked. Lately, we spent a lot of time on housing environments. If you look at the recent legislative actions that have happened in several states, including my own state of Michigan, that chickens, particularly egg-laying hens, veal calves, and swine in the sow gestation stall issue have come to bear on states and then retail food chains, and I'll talk about that in a minute, asking for changes in those types of housing conditions. And when you change, this is probably the hardest part we have when we talk to people who question these things and people who don't have a background in animal agriculture, is that it's not just about one thing. They get focused on providing a type of environment that will allow animals to express their natural behavior, right? But it's not just about behavior, because that behavior is linked in to almost everything, the physiology of the animal and so on. When you change that housing environment, you basically create a domino effect among all the other things that are existing in that environment and that entire farm system. And so when we have to look at this, from a holistic standpoint, we engage a lot of different scientists in this. And you might be a little bit surprised that, we have social scientists engage. I'm probably not as surprised with ag economists that are involved. They do a lot to inform us in terms of where the public is going, the consumer is going on this, also the trade issues that come along with it. But social scientists also help us with regard to understanding people and their understanding of what we're saying to them, but also the understanding of farmers and ranchers. I just came off a study where we did work with farmers and ranchers. It was looking at adaptive multi-paddock grazing, but we had a social science team that was in there that was also asking these farmers questions and ranchers questions about what makes you happy in farming? How are you dealing with the types of pressures that come along with farming? Because we know we've had a horrendous time. And when we get into these deep, deep lows, that we lose farmers as a result of it, not only losing their farms or equipment, but sometimes losing their lives to committing suicide. And so we have them working with us as well. Environmental physiologists who look at the internal environment of housing systems, everything from how that animal interacts with that particular environment, the type of lighting and so on that they need, to agricultural engineers who also work very closely with them to look at the housing impacts, things like ventilation and so on. And I'm not telling anything new here to some people, but we also have employed applied ethicists. They are part of the social scientists are there, but I sit on a number of scientific committees that actually have an applied ethicist sitting there. And sometimes when you come into these problems of animal welfare, we have to sit back and say, what are the value systems people are using here to make these judgments? What is it that we're out of line in terms of understanding what society wants? And then also, after looking at scientific evidence, scientific evidence gives us the evidence to get an idea of what is, what do we know, what do we need to know? But it is actually the ethical world as we know it that tells us what we ought to do. Because in the end, we're asking, what's the right thing to do? What's the right thing to do by the animal? What's the right thing to do by society? What's the right thing to do for farmers and ranchers as well? And so these become very complex questions, and it takes time to tease out all these different parts. The other thing is it's not lost on us the value of having farmers and ranchers work with us. I can't tell you how important it is when a farmer rancher opens up their operation to allowing us to come in and conduct scientific research. And I think Dan can reiterate this. You are incredible partners and helping us understand the day-to-day framework of what you do, how those animals respond in a true production environment. We can do what we can do on the facilities that we have at our universities and in our labs, but really where the rubber hits the road is how it plays out on that working farm. And so what we gain from practical experience, and certainly it's the value of the extension service and those that go out, from industry, sort of extension and outreach type programs in which we get feedback, very valuable feedback, to tell us what are the problems, what do we need to solve, what are we asking you to do that might be absolutely impossible to do, and are there other ways of resolving that issue. But what we learn from all of this really shapes our understanding of what good stewardship of farm animals is. And one of the responsibilities we have is to try to really communicate that to people so they gain that same understanding. One of the other things that certainly happens with regard to farmers and ranchers is that a lot of people don't understand that you deal with a lot more than just what's going on the farm. There is this whole food supply chain complex that you have to deal with. Yes, you deal with some aspects of it in a direct way and other aspects in an indirect way. But over the years, and what I have seen in terms of an incredible dynamic here, at least in the United States, is that there are portions of this supply chain that have exerted incredible pressure on farms and ranchers. And it typically is happening right here in the area of the food retail sector. Many of us have worked, I know Dan has, myself, with McDonald's and other Tyson's and others. in terms of looking at how can we give public assurance about animal welfare throughout this supply chain, on the farm and coming through this entire system. And of course, we've got a boat here with containers on it, knowing that we also export. You know, a lot of people don't understand that farmers also have export markets they have to deal with as well. But the food retail sector has really imposed a lot of expectations for sustaining their corporate social responsibility policies and that throughout their supply chain. So the other question is, what does the public really care about? In general, it's the quality of the life that that animal lives, and also the fact that they have a humane death. But that's also wrapped up in a lot of other issues that come down. And over the years, we've seen certainly housing systems I have at the top, because that's been a top flight conversation for quite some time, whether you're talking about cattle in a feedlot or you're talking about laying hens in battery cages. This has risen to the top over and over again, and we have seen substantial changes, at least in more of the integrated aspects of our different animal industries. Painful procedures, animal health, and Dan will talk more about that. Animal treatment and handling, and this tends to be the place where most of the media coverage has come over the years, is tracking and being able to videotape instances of animal maltreatment and poor handling, or having procedures that are being done that people really don't understand. And a number of us have had to comment on those films that have been taken over time, and teasing out and watching those film clips sometimes can be quite exhausting, to tell you the truth. Synthetic hormone or therapeutic treatments also come along the way, wondering how the animal reacts and wondering whether or not it has anything to do with their affecting the food safety aspects and the consumption of those particular foods. Euthanasia, particularly in terms of on the farm euthanasia, is certainly a concern, an ongoing concern we've had over time, particularly when markets for dairy calves, for example, have gone south. Male dairy cows have gone south. There have, in fact, been instances where there have been horrific instances of people destroying those calves in numerous ways that I don't want to mention, and throwing them out back. These are not things we want to be doing. Certainly can sympathize that it's hard when there's no markets. And of course, what we came through with COVID-19 was absolutely horrendous in terms of having to find ways to depopulate the backup populations of animals that were happening on farms, particularly in the swine industry. These are things that we need to talk about, and we need to make sure we need to do. Shutdown ventilation, for example, is a big conversation right now with regard to the destruction of large number of poultry due to a disease event, for example. And it's hard to explain to the public sometimes where you use these types of extraordinary measures under a disease scenario. And in the last avian flu epidemic, it was hard. They couldn't get CO2. They couldn't get the tools that they needed to try to do it differently. And so shutdown ventilation ended up being the only way that they could destroy a number of animals and also keep it biosecure, because they didn't want human contact with those animals or taking it off the farm. So these are the really sticky wickets and hard things that we have to talk about and deal with and learn about if there are other alternative ways to do that. We try to get those done. Care of sick and young animals is always something that comes to bear. And now the conversation has been access to the outdoors. Right. We have a lot of marketing programs now that hang their hat on animals having access to the outdoors. And of course, the sustainability aspects of talking about this as well is something that is coming to bear in terms of, again, you can change one thing in the environment to accommodate something, but you need to consider all the other things that happen within that domino effect once you start to exact that change. So we know that, over the years, in meeting farm animal demands, at least here in the United States, a lot of it has been through the voluntary, non-regulated routes, to gain public assurance, whether it's through the corporate social responsibility policies that the food retail sector has exacted on farmers and ranchers, The industry imposed standards. The quality assurance programs have come a long, long way with regard to the development of their guidelines, their standards, their training materials, and so on. And then you have the animal protection organizations that have developed their own standards and certification and labeling programs to be able to market to people, and people in that, in that sense, have a choice, or still have a choice of what they want to select off the shelf. And then, of course, there is the government oversight framework, which we have seen primarily play out in terms of certain state initiatives that have happened. I believe there's 26 states that allow for citizen initiatives and at the ballot box in November. And of course, that has been fully taken advantage of by different organizations to be able to push those agendas. We do have some federal regulatory routes. A lot of it is historic legislation that's already in place, like the slaughter, the humane slaughter of livestock, and so on. But stockers and packers and so on, they mandate certain aspects of good stewardship within those particular pieces of legislation in the framework of animal welfare. So how have we responded? Well, in many respects, I have to give a lot of kudos. I think if I have to sit on another committee that puts together guidelines, I think I'm going to pass out. But in many respects, many of us who are scientists have been very proud to serve on a lot of these committees. The development of animal care guidelines and standards using scientific evidence and to be able to identify best practices, it takes time. But once you have them going and established, then it's a matter of keeping up with them and being able to address them and as a living type of document when we know that there's new technologies or management techniques available for us to use. The development of the primary and secondary assessment programs. And what I mean by that is primary is usually meant, these are programs that the farmer or the rancher implements on their own, and they use to assess how well they're doing against, the targets that are set for good care of animals. Secondary assessment is typically bringing in a consultant that might do that for you. And then having those true third-party animal welfare audits are things that actually strive to get public assurance in that you have a third party who has no connection to that farmer or rancher come onto the farm or ranch and then audit against the standards that they're expected to keep. This is a huge transition from where we were 30 or 40 years ago. Huge transition. And in some respects, in a relatively short period of time. And of course, we should be proud of the types of guidance and so on and the developments that have happened over time. This is just an example of many of the industry organizations that have put together guidelines for care and handling of animals. And these quality assurance programs are now, they've extended out to the farm in terms of training and certifications. Beef quality assurance is one of them. I know we've got a bunch of our faculty going through that. And the extension field agents are going through that as well right now. And these are things that are really important for us to think about being part of. Because I don't know how we're going to continue to keep the public aware of the fact that we are doing things ourselves to try to help police ourselves, but also we have other forces that come in, the supply chain in particular, and retailers that also ask for these things, and that there's more oversight of farm animals now than there ever has been in the history of animal ag in the United States. And kudos to the folks who create these training programs. This is just a screenshot, of training programs and that are available to producers and their workers as well. And this is put together by the Pork Checkoff. Lots of hard work went into these, and for producers and ranchers and farmers to take advantage of this is really important. There's also the milieu of organizations that have popped up, and I'm alluding to the top line that do provide training, welfare assessment. These are just a few. And of course, we have our professional animal auditor certification organization that has been put together mostly through started through the professional animal sciences organizations, American Society of Animal Science, Dairy Science, and so on, where they came together. They started to begin to certify and train people as animal auditors, and they also provide a review and certification of those audit and assessment documents that are out there. We have things like FACTA that does something similar in terms of animal welfare assurance and certification. Validus is a private organization that has come along. I think they began at least 20 years ago, maybe, in terms of providing this type of auditing of farms. And then down below, you have some of the industry type labels that have been developed. I put the United Egg Producers on here because probably people see this the most people are buying eggs these days. And then in the middle, lower middle, you've got all the many of the animal protection organization labels, along with USDA Organic, which does have some statements with regard to animal welfare in it, but not a lot at this point. We are probably expecting and looking at that will change, and there will be more implemented. And so these are the types of things that consumers are reading on labels, and they're looking at it and they're wondering about what that is. And in most cases, those guidelines that are industry guidelines are publicly available. They can get online and they can look for them. So to try to start winding this up so that we have a chance to have some questions asked, for challenges, there's many challenges we know of learning more about the science of animal welfare and care, assessment strategies, understanding the data that we're getting back from these auditing programs, and looking at that in real time of understanding what's really happening on those farms and ranches throughout this country. It's important to look at that data. I know through the Common Swine Audit tool, this is where they're eventually going. They get a snapshot of what's actually happening on farms out there. It's probably one of the biggest frustrations that we have had in some respects with some of these some industries, is that it's been hard to get real-time data from multitudes of commercial farms across the United States. And it's good to look at that in aggregate and take an epidemiological approach to also looking at what's happening out there. But meeting the demands for animal welfare by a diverse public is it's going to continue to be a challenge. They're heavily invested in pushing agendas with regard to animal welfare. And there's a lot of conversations, and this is where we work a lot with our ag economists many times, because they can inform us on what these mean when we try to answer these demands. Are farmers and ranchers really getting compensated for meeting these demands? And one thing that we have found, at least as far as a lot of the research that's been done on eggs, is at this point, no. There's been a lot of retail commitments that have been made for cage-free eggs, but right now, they're not really honoring them. You know, we have egg farmers across the country who are converting their facilities, even under these difficult economic times, to cage-free. But many of them are having to put those cage-free eggs right into the same cartons of cage eggs because they can't get the premium that they need by people buying them at the supermarket. So there certainly needs to be a conversation here with what it means for these demands to be met, and what it means for farmers in real time to have to change over facilities to do it. Because we all know the banking industry isn't into giving you loans if you don't have a building that's been depreciated. And oh, by the way, if we're in an economic situation where they don't have the opportunity to actually give you the loan. So we are running into a lot of those issues, particularly with this conversion to cage-free eggs. Communicating with the public about animal welfare. It proves difficult, but I've seen the agricultural community come a long way. We're seeing the blog sites that many farmers and ranchers maintain. I mean, kudos to you for being brave enough to go out there, have that blog and talk. I'm seeing my colleagues that also have blog sites that they can keep up with regard to talking about everything from in the environment, such as Dr. Frank Mitloner does out at UC Davis, to talking about biotechnology. I think those things have to increase over time if we're going to make rational decisions about what animal welfare is and what our commitment will be and what our notion of good stewardship is. One of the difficulties is the increasing villainization of farming animals. Right now, we're going through a phase where a lot of people think the idea to solving all the problems with regard to sustainability has to do with just getting rid of livestock. All right. Beef cattle will probably take the biggest hit, dairy cattle at this point in time in terms of pointing the fingers. But we really need to get a handle on what this holistic idea of sustainability is. And of course, the beef roundtables, the poultry roundtables, and so on are trying to get that accomplished through their conversations and working with partners in the food retail and other communities to try to get that done. But I'm afraid that we're in this right now for the long haul, and we're going to have to think of how we deal with this, the attacks that we have on farmers and ranchers right now with respect to becoming the villains and the easy to pick on candidates for things like climate change. So just to wrap this up, first of all, throughout history, we have always contemplated our relationship and obligation to animals. This is not new. We're victims of our own cultural development, right? We have this conversation, we have these relationships that we need to keep up, even between each other. And this is going to go on forever. As long as we have a relationship with an animal, we're going to have this conversation. And one of the things that makes it hard in animal agriculture, and we need to remember, and really separates us out from the plant community, is that we're not canning tomatoes, right? And we shouldn't act like we're canning tomatoes. These animals, they are sentient, they feel, they're the one thing on earth that can look back at us and we wonder what they're thinking, okay? So we have to be very respectful of why people feel the way they do about animals and why we have a commitment to have to be able to have that conversation about the type of stewardship that we exact with these animals and the type of care that we have for them. Farmers and ranchers have historically been expected to be good stewards of the land. I don't expect that to change, and I don't expect that expectation to change within farmers and ranchers either. It's been part of their framework for a very long time, and it will continue well into the future. And then the scientific and understanding of biological and behavioral needs of animals has really provided us with more evidence-based information to help us advance and improve our best practices. And so I expect this continuous improvement in animal welfare to keep going. But I still expect that the road ahead is going to continue to be challenging. And so with that, I think I'm pretty much on time here, and we have a few minutes left to be able to take questions. So thank you very much for listening to me today.
Let's thank Janice. So there's a question that came in online. The question is this okay? Does the speaker have any thoughts on Tipple Grandin and her contributions to animal husbandry? And additionally, are you familiar with the book by Joel Salatin, The Wonderful Pigness of Pigs?
Yes.
It comes at animal husbandry from a biblical Christian worldview. And he would encourage any Catholic in animal production to look into it because it may challenge many views, but no matter your production model, please do not feel judged, as we all care about being good stewards of God's creation.
Yes, yes, I have actually, and I haven't had a chance to meet Joe Salatin yet. But I certainly have read his work and his ideas, and again, this is a view that we will be working with in looking into how sustainable we are, and sustainable animal welfare is well ingrained into that framework of sustainability. And of course, this is going to be worked out over time. But it is a different framework from which Joe works from. And Joe has a clientele that he has a great following with regard to his own farm and his direct marketing to consumers. And that is one way. And I did have on my graph direct marketing, that graphic that I had of the supply chain, that there is direct marketing through farmers markets and so on. And I think it's a wonderful choice to be added for people who feel that this is how they want to have their food produced as well. But make no mistake about it, we also have 400 million people in this country that need to be fed every day. And finding a way to do that in a more sustainable manner, and also to safeguard the welfare of those animals, is really important. With respect to Temple Grandin, I know her very well, and I respect her, and she's done a terrific job with pushing along and being sort of a pioneer and asking us to reconsider the way we build facilities for animals, the way we handle facilities. And by George, she's written a lot of books about this. And of course, very dedicated individual. Actually, I had her speaking to my class just a couple of weeks ago. So very familiar with Temple Grandin. I don't know anybody who isn't. And she's instituted a lot of change in here. We've sat on a lot of committees together. So I'm very pleased to call her a colleague and a friend and be part of the work that she has done on a number of these different committees in which we sit.
Thanks. I think I'm good to actually walk around and hand this mic off so other people can address questions to you. Can you hear us, Janice?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. Yes, I was thinking about while you were giving your presentation, Dr. Swanson, and like we said before, it was science-based, but in the church we have a patron saint for about everything, and we have a patron saint for animals, Saint Francis of Assisi, yeah. And obviously he had some animal welfare in mind back in his day. I guess my question is, what kind of input and feedback do you get from the church side or from the spirituality side?
You know, we do, in a sense, with the discussions that we have with our applied ethicists when we get involved with them on projects. You know, they bring us both the secular and non-secular versions of these things that we talk about with respect to excuse me, what our obligations should be to animals. But in terms of direct feedback, I can't say I've had much. I had met many years ago Reverend Andrew Lindsay, who wrote quite a bit about this. He's English and was probably one of the first who really came out with books that tried to position this in the way that religion would view it. Since then, there's been a number of people that have contributed to that body of work with regard to animal welfare. I think it's an important view to have because I can't say this for sure because I've never run the survey, but I would say a lot of farmers and ranchers come from a religious background in terms of how they view their responsibility to animals and the stewardship and looking at how the Bible had characterized that. And I think it is part of what really strengthens their ethics in terms of feeling this obligation to be good stewards of the land and also of animals. I don't know if that completely, answers your question, Art, but I haven't had a lot of direct feedback, so to speak, from the religious community, but I have certainly read articles and I'm aware people have written from the religious aspect of this.
It may have been a little selfish in that maybe we have some work to do in that area as well. Thank you.
Hello, this is Kelly Wondra. I guess my question is how do we battle and face the realistic pushes for better animal welfare and those that are just trying to eliminate animals? I raise pigs. I'm GAP certified, so we are in some of that, taking into account third-party auditing and things like that. But now that I'm looking, there's there's an initiative in Colorado to get something put on the ballot. I think it basically deals with a whole lot of things, but one of them is not allowing their animals to get butchered until they've lived 25% of their natural life.
Oh,
So
wow.
that would mean, like on cattle, they're saying a natural life of a cow is 20 years. So they
Yeah.
wouldn't be able to butcher cattle until they're 5 years old. Pigs, they'd have to be 2.5 years old before they can butcher them. So that, those are not things that are realistic. That's just trying to eliminate animal production. And we think, okay, yeah, common sense prevail. But we're getting to that time that you think, will common sense prevail? So.
Yeah, this is really difficult. And this is part of the frustration, actually, we've had as scientists, having to work in this area, particularly when people are trying to set standards for animals in law. And it always ends up being a politically negotiated, for example, space requirement. It's politically negotiated. Is it the real space requirement that animals actually need? Many times it's not. And the hen doesn't know, for example, any different. She needs what she needs, but it's not politically negotiated. I think that really, and the lack of representation of agriculture in some of our legislative bodies is also something that's concerning. Maybe not so much at the state level, but especially at the federal level. We need to become more adept at speaking out and being able to express our points of view in a way that people will get it. I hope that what happens in Colorado is that there is a push for some type of sanity to come along. I mean, it's hard when you have these ballot initiative states that people can vote on a good idea or what they think is a good idea, or the language is couched in such a way that there's no way anybody would vote against it. It's pretty hard. So somehow you've got to take what's being proposed and be able to put it in a way that the public can actually understand it on their terms. That's, I hadn't heard about that, but I'm certainly going to fish right into the legislative text that you see in Colorado to get a handle on that, because that's a new one. That's a new one to me. 25% of their life. Okay, what would that mean for the flow of animals through the system? What would that mean? You got to really be able to quantify, but also qualify what that means for the American public and let them think about it. And you have to get on it early. You can't wait till the last minute.
I think that finishes up our questions. We're on to the next presenter. Again, Dr. Swanson, we really appreciate you taking the time today to share your knowledge and wisdom on animal welfare, and I think it's a perfect segue into what Dan's going to talk about. So it's great that we had you two work together. We appreciate that.
Hey, Dan, how's it going? Handing off to you now. See y'all later, and thank you.